first warning came long before anyone heard the engines. In the gray light before dawn, a German colonel stood at the edge of a forest road somewhere in Belgium, watching an endless line of captured American fuel trucks disappear into the mist. The smell of gasoline hung heavy in the freezing December air. Steel drums were stacked higher than a man. Fuel tankers stretched so far down the road that the last vehicles vanished into the fog. For the first time in months, German soldiers laughed. Drivers who had spent weeks rationing every drop slapped each other on the back. Tank crews, who had learned to fear empty fuel gauges more than enemy artillery, stared in disbelief at what looked like a miracle. It was everything they had prayed for. More than 50,000 gallons of American fuel had fallen into German hands. Officers called it a gift from fate. Staff maps were redrawn. New attack routes suddenly seemed possible. Engines that had been silent could roar back to life. Columns that should have stopped could continue toward their objective. In a war where fuel had become more valuable than ammunition, this single capture felt like a victory worth celebrating. But one man wasn't celebrating. The colonel walked slowly between the tankers, running a gloved hand across the cold metal of an American fuel drum. Instead of relief, he felt something else. Something that refused to leave him. Around him, exhausted soldiers saw salvation. He saw a question no one else was asking. If America could lose this much fuel, how much did it still have? The answer would haunt him for the rest of the war. Because what looked like Germany's greatest logistical prize would soon become undeniable proof that the Third Reich was fighting an enemy it could no longer hope to outproduce, outrun, or outlast. For years, military history has celebrated dramatic battles, daring offensives, and brilliant generals. Maps are filled with arrows pushing across Europe. Photographs capture tanks charging through snow-covered villages and infantry storming shattered towns. Victory is often measured in miles gained or cities captured. Yet history rarely pauses to ask a different question. What kept those armies moving in the first place? Behind every advancing tank stood thousands of gallons of fuel. Behind every bomber crossing the skies stood refineries, pipelines, truck convoys, mechanics, and factory workers scattered across continents. Every bullet fired, every bridge crossed, every mile advanced depended on a supply system so vast that most soldiers never saw it. And by the winter of 1944, that invisible war had become more important than every battlefield combined. The German High Command believed one final offensive could split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force Britain and the United States to negotiate. It was an audacious gamble, built on surprise, speed, and sheer determination. Commanders promised their men that once American fuel dumps were captured, the offensive would sustain itself. Every gallon seized from the enemy would carry German armor deeper into Allied territory. On paper, it was a masterpiece. On the ground, it depended on a single terrifying assumption: that the Allies could be starved before Germany ran dry. Few questioned the plan. After all, German forces had achieved impossible victories before. France had fallen in weeks. Entire Soviet armies had once collapsed beneath relentless armored assaults. Time and again, bold decisions had overturned impossible odds. Why should this be any different? Because this time, the battlefield itself had changed. What many German commanders failed to grasp was that they were no longer fighting the same America they had underestimated years earlier. Across the Atlantic, factories operated day and night beneath glowing lights. Oil flowed from Texas, Oklahoma, and California in quantities almost impossible to imagine. Tankers crossed oceans without pause. New trucks rolled off assembly lines faster than the Axis could destroy them. Entire fuel depots could disappear and be replaced almost before the smoke had cleared. The colonel understood this in a single chilling moment. Standing beside those captured American fuel trucks, he began doing calculations in his head. How many convoys had delivered this fuel? How many more were already on the road? How many millions of gallons waited just beyond the horizon? The numbers refused to make sense. Not because they were too small, because they were unimaginably large. Within 24 hours, German armored columns would begin burning through the precious fuel they had just captured. Within days, desperate crews would once again search abandoned vehicles for a few remaining liters of gasoline. Within weeks, entire formations would grind to a halt as engines fell silent in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. And within months, Allied armies fueled by an industrial machine unlike anything the world had ever seen would cross the Rhine and carry the war into the heart of Germany itself. But none of that was visible yet. All anyone could see were rows of American fuel tankers standing beneath gray winter skies. To the young soldiers celebrating around them, they represented hope. To Berlin, they represented momentum. To newspaper headlines that would never know the full story, they represented German ingenuity. But to one experienced officer who had spent years watching supply reports grow thinner, trains arrive emptier, and fuel allocations shrink month after month, those trucks revealed something entirely different. They were not evidence of Germany's strength. They were evidence of America's abundance. That realization transformed a moment of triumph into something far more unsettling. Because in that frozen clearing, surrounded by more fuel than many German divisions had seen in months, the colonel understood a truth that strategy, courage, and battlefield brilliance could no longer overcome. Germany had not captured enough fuel to win the war. It had merely captured enough to understand why it never could. And the road leading away from those fuel trucks was about to carry Europe toward one of the most decisive and least understood lessons of the Second World War. The engines came alive just before first light. One after another, the deep rumble of German tanks echoed through the snow-covered Ardennes forest. Their exhaust drifted into the icy air as mechanics pulled away frozen canvas covers and drivers checked fuel gauges with nervous eyes. Every crew knew the same uncomfortable truth. They had enough gasoline to begin the offensive, but perhaps not enough to finish it. That uncertainty had shaped every order issued by the German High Command. Unlike earlier campaigns, this attack wasn't simply about breaking enemy lines. It was a race against an invisible clock, a clock measured not in hours, but in gallons. Far above the forests, thick clouds concealed the movement below. It was exactly the weather Germany had hoped for. Allied aircraft, which had dominated European skies for months, remained grounded by fog and snow. For the first time since Normandy, German commanders believed they possessed something resembling surprise. Across the front, American soldiers settled into what they believed would be another quiet winter morning. Many units stationed in the Ardennes were inexperienced replacements or exhausted veterans sent there to recover after months of fighting. The region was considered one of the safest sectors on the Western Front. Intelligence officers saw little reason to expect a major German attack through dense forests and narrow mountain roads during the harshest winter in years. The assumption felt reasonable. It was also dangerously wrong. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, the silence shattered. Hundreds of German artillery pieces opened fire almost simultaneously. Shells crashed into American positions, ripping apart communication lines, ammunition dumps, and command posts. Entire hillsides disappeared behind walls of smoke and flying timber. Telephone operators desperately tried reconnecting severed wires while officers struggled to determine whether this was merely a local assault or the beginning of something far larger. Within minutes, the answer arrived. German infantry emerged from the forests. Behind them came armored columns pushing west with astonishing speed. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. For the German soldiers advancing through the snow, this offensive represented more than another military operation. It was their final opportunity to change the course of the war. Many understood the odds. Some had fought since Poland in 1939. Others had survived France, the Balkans, North Africa, and the endless brutality of the Eastern Front. They had watched experienced friends disappear one campaign after another. They had seen new recruits arrive younger, less prepared, and often without enough equipment. Yet despite everything, they continued forward. Not because they believed victory was guaranteed, but because they hoped one decisive gamble might accomplish what years of attrition could not. Among the armored spearheads moving through the forests was the colonel whose name would later become linked with one of the war's most revealing discoveries. Unlike younger officers intoxicated by the excitement of the attack, he carried the caution of experience. His maps contained more than roads and objectives. They contained numbers, fuel consumption, truck capacity, expected losses, distance to American supply dumps. Every kilometer his unit advanced increased the danger that success itself could become a trap. A tank advancing rapidly burned more fuel than one sitting still. An unexpected detour could consume precious reserves. Even a brief firefight forced engines to idle for hours in freezing temperatures. Every decision carried a logistical cost. It was mathematics as much as military strategy. Yet Berlin demanded speed. Hitler's plan depended on striking so quickly that Allied commanders would lose control before they could react. German armored divisions were ordered to seize bridges intact, bypass strongpoints whenever possible, and drive relentlessly toward the River Meuse. Everything depended on momentum, and momentum depended on fuel. The irony was impossible to ignore. Germany, once famous for lightning-fast blitzkrieg campaigns, now struggled to provide enough gasoline for its own tanks. Years of Allied bombing had devastated synthetic fuel plants across the Reich. Romanian oil fields, the lifeblood of Germany's war machine, had largely been lost. Rail networks lay in ruins. Every train carrying fuel risked destruction before reaching the front. Entire armored divisions existed on paper but remained immobilized because there simply wasn't enough gasoline to move them. German officers no longer asked whether fuel was important. They asked whether there would be any at all. Meanwhile, only a few miles away, American logistics operated on a scale that seemed almost unimaginable. Roads stretching back toward France carried endless convoys of fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, ambulances, engineering vehicles, and food supplies. Drivers worked around the clock. Some traveled hundreds of miles without stopping. When one convoy reached its destination, another had already begun the journey behind it. Few frontline soldiers ever noticed. To them, fuel simply appeared when needed. They rarely considered the vast network required to deliver it. Pipelines crossed liberated France. Temporary fuel depots filled abandoned fields. Railroads unloaded thousands of tons every day. Tankers arrived from across the Atlantic with cargoes measured not in thousands of gallons, but in millions. It was an industrial rhythm that had become almost invisible because it functioned so efficiently. German intelligence knew the Allies possessed enormous resources. What they underestimated was the speed with which those resources could replace themselves. Destroy one depot, another opened farther west. Capture one convoy, two more were already approaching. Bomb one rail yard. Construction crews restored operations with astonishing speed. The colonel had witnessed this pattern before. Months earlier, during the Allied breakout from Normandy, German units repeatedly reported destroying American supply columns. Yet somehow the flow never seemed to stop. Every apparent victory was swallowed by another wave of trucks. At first, many dismissed it as exaggeration. Then came reconnaissance reports, photographs, captured documents. The evidence became impossible to deny. America wasn't simply supplying an army. It was supplying an entire continent. Still, during the opening days of the Ardennes offensive, hope remained alive. German forces punched deep into Allied lines. Several American units became isolated. Confusion spread through headquarters as conflicting reports arrived almost hourly. Road intersections changed hands repeatedly. Snow-covered villages echoed with gunfire. Signposts were deliberately altered by German commandos disguised as American soldiers, creating chaos behind the front. For a brief moment, it seemed the impossible might actually happen. Then came the discovery. Near one of the advancing routes, German scouts reported something extraordinary. An American fuel storage area had been abandoned in the confusion of the retreat. At first, headquarters assumed it contained only a few scattered barrels. But as reconnaissance continued, the scale became clearer. Rows of fuel trucks, storage tanks, thousands upon thousands of gallons of high-octane gasoline, enough to keep entire armored formations moving. Word spread rapidly through the advancing columns. Drivers smiled for the first time in weeks. Tank commanders calculated how much farther they could advance. Officers began revising operational maps almost immediately. The offensive suddenly appeared to have found its missing lifeline. When the colonel finally arrived, soldiers were already celebrating. Some posed beside captured American tankers. Others joked that the Americans had unknowingly supplied Germany's final offensive. Mechanics eagerly prepared hoses to transfer gasoline into waiting Panthers and Tigers. The atmosphere felt almost festive despite the distant sound of artillery rolling across the frozen hills. Yet amid the excitement, the colonel remained strangely silent. He walked slowly through the captured depot. He counted vehicles, estimated storage capacity, examined markings on fuel drums, studied shipping labels still attached to American containers. Then he noticed something almost everyone else ignored. Many of the trucks were nearly new. The tires showed little wear. Replacement parts were neatly packed alongside spare equipment. Even the containers themselves appeared almost disposable. It wasn't merely the amount of fuel that disturbed him. It was what surrounded it. An army confident enough to abandon tens of thousands of gallons in the middle of an offensive was an army that expected to replace it. That realization settled over him like the falling snow. His men saw treasure. He saw production. He saw factories operating beyond the reach of German bombers. He saw oil wells pumping without interruption. He saw thousands more trucks waiting across the Atlantic. For the first time since the offensive began, a quiet thought formed in his mind. Perhaps Germany had mistaken abundance for vulnerability. Perhaps the very size of America's supply system meant losses that seemed catastrophic to Germany were little more than temporary inconvenience to the Allies. He never spoke those words aloud. Instead, he issued practical orders. Refuel every available vehicle. Protect the depot. Move quickly before Allied aircraft returned. On the surface, nothing about his behavior appeared unusual. But those who served under him later remembered something different. The excitement visible in every other officer never reached his face. It was as though he had already seen an ending no one else could imagine. And before the next sunrise, the first signs would appear that the captured fuel, remarkable as it was, could never solve Germany's greatest problem. By nightfall, the celebration had faded into routine. The captured fuel was no longer a miracle. It had become another line on a logistics report. Mechanics worked beneath dim lanterns, transferring gasoline from American tankers into German Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, and supply trucks. The smell of fuel mixed with diesel exhaust and wet pine as men labored in temperatures well below freezing. Every hose had to be watched carefully. Every gallon mattered. No one wasted a drop. For soldiers who had spent months counting every liter, the sight of overflowing tanks felt almost unreal. But fuel, the colonel knew, had one unforgiving characteristic. The moment it entered an engine, it immediately began disappearing. The next morning, German armored columns pushed deeper into Belgium. Snow muffled the sound of tracks as heavy vehicles rolled through villages that had scarcely recovered from the war's previous battles. Church bells remained silent. Civilians watched cautiously from broken windows, uncertain which army would occupy their streets by sunset. The offensive was still moving. Maps inside headquarters showed encouraging progress. Several Allied positions had collapsed. American commanders struggled to understand the scale of the assault. Roads were clogged with retreating vehicles, refugees, engineers, and military police attempting to restore order. For a brief moment, German commanders allowed themselves something they had not felt in a long time: confidence. Yet confidence can be dangerously deceptive. Every mile gained increased another problem that maps rarely showed. The farther the spearheads advanced, the longer their supply lines became. Behind the front, German truck drivers fought a battle few history books describe. The Ardennes was a nightmare for logistics. Its narrow roads twisted through steep valleys and dense forests. A single disabled truck could halt an entire convoy. Snowdrifts blocked mountain passes. Ice turned downhill roads into deadly slides for vehicles carrying thousands of gallons of gasoline. Drivers often traveled without headlights to avoid Allied reconnaissance. Engines overheated despite the freezing weather. Broken axles were repaired beside the road with frozen hands. A convoy delayed by only an hour could leave an armored division waiting for fuel before dawn. The colonel understood that the offensive was no longer advancing at the speed of tanks. It was advancing at the speed of trucks. And trucks were becoming slower every day. Then another report arrived. An advanced reconnaissance unit had located additional abandoned American supplies. Not just fuel, food, winter clothing, medical equipment, boxes of ammunition, fresh tires, entire repair workshops left behind during the chaotic Allied withdrawal. Some younger officers interpreted this as proof that the Americans were collapsing. "They're running," one captain reportedly said. "They're leaving everything behind." The word spread quickly. After years of retreat, German soldiers desperately wanted to believe them. Who wouldn't? The evidence seemed visible everywhere. abandoned vehicles, discarded rations, destroyed bridges, retreating enemy columns. It looked remarkably similar to victories Germany had achieved years earlier. But appearances can deceive. Far behind the American lines, another army was already moving. It wasn't carrying rifles. It wasn't manning tanks. It wasn't preparing artillery. It was driving trucks, thousands of them. While German commanders celebrated captured depots, Allied logisticians were calmly calculating replacements. Every gallon lost was entered into reports. Replacement shipments were rerouted. Reserve depots were opened. Fresh convoys departed within hours. The American system did not depend on a single warehouse. It depended on a network. Destroy one artery, the blood simply flowed through another. It was an industrial organism unlike anything Germany had ever faced. The colonel sensed this before most of his superiors. One evening, after reviewing fresh intelligence, he unfolded an American logistics map recovered from an abandoned command vehicle. At first glance, it resembled a spider's web. Roads connected to roads. Pipelines linked depots. Railways fed truck columns. Temporary fuel dumps stretched across liberated France like stepping stones leading all the way back to the Normandy beaches. He stared at it for several minutes. Not because it revealed troop positions. Because it revealed capacity. Each symbol represented more than storage. It represented replacement. For every depot the Germans captured, there were others. For every convoy destroyed, another departed. The map illustrated something no battlefield victory could erase. America wasn't winning because it possessed more fuel. America was winning because it could never stop producing it. That night, while many officers discussed tomorrow's objectives, the colonel quietly asked his logistics staff a different question. How long can we continue at this pace? The answer came after several calculations. If everything goes perfectly, pause, perhaps 4 days. If roads remained open, if trucks reached the front, if captured fuel remained usable, if Allied aircraft stayed grounded, if bridges survived. Too many ifs. Wars are rarely decided by perfect conditions. Outside, snow continued falling. The weather remained Germany's greatest ally. Clouds still protected the advancing columns from Allied fighter bombers that had devastated them during previous campaigns. Every German officer knew this protection was temporary. Eventually, the skies would clear. No one knew when, but everyone knew what would follow. Meanwhile, across the front, American resistance began hardening. Scattered defensive positions refused to surrender. Engineers demolished bridges moments before German armor arrived. Military police redirected retreating units into new defensive lines. Artillery batteries established firing positions overlooking narrow roads. Individual acts of resistance started buying precious hours. Hours became days. Days became opportunities. In one snow-covered crossroads, a handful of American engineers delayed an entire armored column while destroying a bridge beneath enemy fire. Elsewhere, tank destroyers fought until ammunition ran out before withdrawing to secondary positions. Each delay seemed insignificant. Collectively, they slowed the offensive, and every hour lost consumed more gasoline. The colonel watched fuel reports with growing concern. Consumption exceeded expectations. Vehicles idled longer than planned. Recovery trucks burned extra fuel towing damaged tanks. Detours around destroyed bridges added dozens of unnecessary miles. The captured American gasoline was vanishing faster than anyone predicted. One mechanic later described the situation with brutal simplicity. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. No matter how much arrived, it never seemed enough. Then came the first clear morning. Almost unnoticed at first, patches of blue appeared above the Ardennes. The fog lifted. Clouds broke apart. Sunlight reflected brilliantly from fresh snow. To exhausted infantrymen, it was beautiful. To German logistics officers, it was terrifying. Within hours, the distant sound returned. Aircraft, hundreds of them, Allied fighters and fighter bombers roared across the sky, hunting roads, bridges, fuel trucks, and anything that moved. Convoys that had traveled safely for days suddenly scattered into forests. Drivers abandoned burning vehicles. Fuel tankers exploded with tremendous force, sending black columns of smoke thousands of feet into the air. Entire supply routes disappeared beneath relentless air attacks. The colonel stood beside a roadside embankment watching one of his fuel convoys burn. Tankers exploded one after another. Months of precious gasoline vanished within minutes. No speech. No dramatic outburst. Only silence. Around him, officers hurried to reorganize surviving vehicles. Roads filled with wreckage. Traffic halted. Timetables collapsed. The offensive had not stopped because German soldiers lacked courage. It was slowing because its lifeblood was catching fire. And as another logistics report arrived that evening, the colonel realized an uncomfortable truth. The greatest enemy facing his army was no longer the American soldier. It was the impossible distance between Germany's empty fuel depots and America's endless supply. The next morning, the roads told a story that no battlefield report could hide. Burned-out fuel tankers lined the frozen highways like blackened skeletons. Craters filled with slush interrupted every major route. Horses pulled wagons around wrecked trucks because there was no room to pass. Engineers worked frantically to clear overturned vehicles while military police waved columns into narrow forest tracks that had never been intended for heavy armor. The offensive was still alive, but it was no longer moving with confidence. It was struggling forward 1 mile at a time. Inside the German command network, radio operators passed increasingly urgent messages between headquarters. Need immediate fuel. Convoy delayed. Bridge destroyed. Request priority resupply. Each message sounded isolated. Together, they painted a far more dangerous picture. Entire armored formations were beginning to outrun their own logistics. For years, German officers had mastered the art of operational warfare. They could coordinate infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers with remarkable precision. They had stunned Europe with lightning campaigns that became the very definition of blitzkrieg. But blitzkrieg had always relied on one assumption: that fuel would keep arriving. Now that assumption was collapsing. The colonel spread several maps across a wooden farmhouse table that had become his temporary command post. The room was cold enough that frost had formed inside the windows. A lantern flickered over colored pencils, casualty reports, and fuel allocation charts. Outside, tank engines idled impatiently while officers waited for new orders. He ignored the tactical maps. Instead, he studied the supply routes. One road had become blocked by destroyed bridges. Another was under constant Allied air attack. A third had become impassable because abandoned vehicles stretched for miles. Every solution created another problem. Move trucks by daylight, aircraft destroyed them. Move them only at night, progress slowed to a crawl. Use secondary roads, vehicles became trapped in deep snow. Each option consumed more fuel than it saved. For the first time since the offensive began, the colonel realized he was commanding mathematics instead of soldiers. The numbers simply refused to cooperate. Not far away, the crews inside Panther tanks noticed something they had hoped never to see. Fuel needles were dropping faster than replacement trucks could arrive. Drivers began shutting down engines whenever possible, even during brief halts. Mechanics prohibited unnecessary movement. Tank commanders ordered crews to push lighter vehicles by hand rather than waste precious gasoline. The contrast was striking. These were machines built to race across Europe. Now they sat motionless beside frozen roads, conserving every remaining liter. One veteran loader later recalled that silence became more frightening than gunfire. When the engines stopped, he remembered, everyone looked at the fuel gauge first, because everyone understood what came next. A tank without fuel wasn't merely useless. It became an immovable bunker, an obstacle, eventually, target. Across the battlefield, American commanders were beginning to recognize something equally important. German attacks remained dangerous, but they were losing momentum. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft showed long traffic jams hidden beneath forest canopies. Smoke from destroyed supply convoys rose above the trees. Captured prisoners repeatedly mentioned shortages, not of ammunition, but of gasoline. At Allied headquarters, logistics officers responded almost instinctively. Increase deliveries, open new fuel dumps, expand transportation routes, redirect additional truck companies toward the front. The response wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve heroic charges or brilliant tactical innovations. It was paperwork, schedules, rail timetables, convoy manifests, thousands of drivers following carefully planned routes through France and Belgium. It was the quiet machinery of industrial warfare. Most history books celebrate the generals who ordered armies forward. Far fewer remember the men who spent 16 hours behind the wheel of a fuel truck. Yet those anonymous drivers were becoming just as important as the soldiers carrying rifles. Day after day, endless convoys rolled east. Some drivers had never fired a weapon in combat. Others rarely saw the front lines. But each journey carried the fuel that allowed tanks to move, artillery to fire, ambulances to evacuate the wounded, and engineers to build bridges. One convoy disappeared into Belgium. Another immediately replaced it. Then another. Then another. It seemed endless. German reconnaissance officers watched these columns with growing disbelief. Bombing them slowed the flow. Destroying bridges diverted traffic. Capturing depots caused temporary confusion. Nothing stopped it. The colonel thought back to the captured American fuel dump that had seemed so extraordinary only days earlier. At the time, it had looked enormous. Now, it looked insignificant. Not because 50,000 gallons wasn't valuable. It absolutely was. But because he finally understood where it fit within America's larger system. It was one reservoir, not because victory seemed likely, but because soldiers rarely have the luxury of choosing the wars they inherit. Across the Allied lines, the lessons were equally profound. American logisticians received little public recognition. Their names rarely appeared in newspapers. Few civilians celebrated the engineers who repaired bridges overnight or the truck drivers who crossed icy roads without sleep. There were no dramatic photographs of pipeline planners or quartermasters calculating fuel allocations beneath dim lamps. But every successful offensive depended on them. Every liberated town. Every advancing tank. Every aircraft that took to the skies. Behind each visible victory stood thousands of invisible decisions made far from the battlefield. The Battle of the Bulge reinforced a lesson that modern militaries still study today. Tactics may win battles. Leadership may inspire armies. Technology may change how wars are fought. But logistics determines how long they can continue. Military academies across the world continue to teach this principle. Not because of abstract theory, but because history demonstrated it with brutal clarity during the winter of 1944. The Ardennes became one of the greatest examples of a simple truth. An army moves only as far as its supplies allow. That lesson reshaped military planning after the war. Supply chains became strategic weapons. Fuel security became a national priority. Engineers, transportation specialists, and industrial planners gained a place beside battlefield commanders in determining military success. Future conflicts, from Korea to the Persian Gulf, would prove again and again that wars are sustained not only by soldiers at the front, but by millions of people working far behind it. Factories, railroads, ports, pipelines, convoys, refineries. The invisible machinery of war had finally become impossible to ignore. Looking back today, it is tempting to imagine that Germany's defeat became inevitable only when Allied armies entered its cities. But history rarely changes in a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it changes quietly. Sometimes it changes when a commander studies a logistics report. Sometimes it changes beside a road lined with fuel trucks. The colonel never needed to see Berlin surrounded to understand what lay ahead. He had already seen the evidence. Not in the strength of the American army, but in its ability to recover, to replace, to continue. That was the true significance of those 50,000 gallons. To many soldiers, they represented abundance. To him, they represented proportion. If the Allies could lose that much fuel, without changing the outcome of the campaign, then the scale of their resources was beyond anything Germany could hope to overcome. It was no longer a contest of bravery. It was a contest of capacity. And capacity had become feeding an ocean. And oceans cannot be emptied with buckets. One evening, while inspecting abandoned American equipment, he found a logistics notebook left behind by an Allied quartermaster. Its pages contained routine inventory figures. Fuel delivered. Fuel issued. Expected replacements. Nothing appeared remarkable until he reached the totals. The quantities were staggering. The figures represented volumes that German supply officers could scarcely imagine. Entire monthly allocations for German formations appeared equivalent to what some American depots handled in days. The notebook didn't boast. It didn't celebrate American superiority. It simply recorded ordinary business. That ordinary business was precisely what frightened him. Wars often create moments of dramatic revelation. Sometimes they arrive during great battles. Sometimes through shocking intelligence. Sometimes while standing over a captured document. For the colonel, realization came quietly. He closed the notebook, looked across the snowy fields, and understood that Germany was no longer competing against another army. It was competing against another economy, against another continent, against factories operating around the clock, against oil fields thousands of miles away that no German soldier could ever reach, against shipyards launching new tankers before old ones completed their voyages, against an industrial engine whose full power had only recently begun to reveal itself. No battlefield victory could change that. Even if German forces captured another fuel depot, and another, the balance would remain the same. America could replace losses faster than Germany could create them. It was a race with unequal starting points. As January approached, the offensive continued to weaken. German attacks became smaller. Objectives were reduced. Units that had once advanced confidently now fought simply to avoid encirclement. The fuel that had promised victory was nearly gone. Many tanks were abandoned by their own crews after their engines fell silent. Some were destroyed to prevent capture. Others remained beside frozen roads until Allied soldiers passed them weeks later. Their armor was intact. Their guns were loaded. Their crews had not been defeated by superior firepower. They had simply run out of gasoline. Years later, veterans on both sides would remember the Battle of the Bulge for its bitter cold, brutal fighting, and extraordinary courage. But hidden beneath every dramatic story was another battle that few civilians ever witnessed. A battle fought with pipelines instead of rifles, with truck convoys instead of cavalry, with refinery output instead of battlefield speeches. It was a contest measured not by territory, but by endurance. The German colonel never forgot the day he stood among those captured American fuel trucks. Others remembered it as a triumph. He remembered it as the moment the illusion disappeared. Because in that sea of gasoline, he had seen something far larger than a temporary victory. He had seen the future of the war. And as Allied forces prepared to launch the counteroffensive that would drive Germany back across the Ardennes, one final question remained unanswered. If logistics had decided the outcome of this campaign, how would history remember the men who understood that truth before almost anyone else? The last German vehicles left the Ardennes the same way they had entered it, through forests buried beneath winter snow. But nothing about the retreat resembled the confidence of those first days. The roads that had once carried armored spearheads toward the River Meuse were now crowded with exhausted columns moving in the opposite direction. Trucks without fuel were abandoned where they stopped. Tanks that crews had fought desperately to protect were destroyed by their own engineers to keep them from falling into Allied hands. Horses once again pulled artillery through frozen mud because engines could no longer be trusted to complete the journey. For many soldiers, the offensive had ended not with a decisive battle, but with silence. The silence of engines that would never start again. The silence of radios waiting for supplies that would never arrive. The silence of men who finally understood that courage alone could no longer change the course of the war. The German colonel who had stood among 50,000 gallons of captured American fuel returned from the Ardennes carrying no great trophy. No medal marked the moment he realized what that fuel truly represented. No official report recorded the thoughts that crossed his mind as he studied the endless rows of American tankers. History remembers victories. It rarely remembers realizations. Yet some realizations shape history just as profoundly as battles. Because long before Berlin fell, long before Allied soldiers crossed the Rhine, long before the final surrender documents were signed, some officers had already recognized an uncomfortable truth. Germany had not simply been outnumbered. It had been outproduced. For the ordinary German soldier, that realization came slowly. Many had entered the Ardennes believing they were participating in one last decisive gamble that might force the Western Allies into negotiations. Instead, they watched their divisions shrink with every passing week. Fuel became scarcer. Replacement vehicles became rarer. Experienced crews disappeared faster than they could be replaced. Entire formations that had once terrified Europe became shadows of their former strength. The psychological toll was immense. Hope gave way to endurance. Endurance gave way to resignation. Yet they continued fighting, come destiny. The irony remains one of the most striking in the history of the Second World War. Germany captured exactly what it needed most. The fuel its tanks desperately lacked. The resource that commanders had risked an entire offensive to obtain. For a few brief hours, it looked like the answer to every logistical nightmare. Instead, it became proof that the nightmare could never truly end. Because no captured depot, no matter how large, could compete with an industrial system capable of replacing it many times over. That is why the story was never really about 50,000 gallons of gasoline. It was never only about one German colonel, or one captured fuel dump, or even the Battle of the Bulge itself. It was about the invisible forces that decide the fate of nations long before the final battle is fought. It was about engineers whose names rarely entered history books, factory workers who never saw the front, truck drivers who crossed continents without recognition, oil workers drilling thousands of miles from the battlefield, railway crews repairing bomb tracks before dawn, millions of ordinary people whose combined efforts became more powerful than any single army. When we think of the Second World War, we often picture charging tanks, fighter aircraft, and dramatic battlefield victories. Yet beneath every one of those images flowed something less glamorous, but infinitely more decisive. Fuel. Not merely the liquid inside a tank, but the entire system required to deliver it. The roads, the pipelines, the refineries, the ships, the factories, the people. That was the true battlefield. And in that battlefield, Germany had already lost. So when that German colonel stood among 50,000 gallons of captured American fuel, he wasn't looking at victory. He was looking at the first unmistakable glimpse of an ending that had already begun. Because in war, the loudest explosions may capture history's attention, but it is often the quiet arithmetic of supply that decides who will still be standing when the guns finally fall silent.